I've got Mr. BobLee here again. He's back. I asked him to come back, and he's back. Hey, we're not necessarily talking about sports. Mr. Bob wrote a column about his hometown, Kinston. He said he got over 90 comments on it. A really interesting read, a lot of content. If you haven't seen it, go to BobLeeSays.com and look at it. It's there right now. It's a top story because he hasn't written much of anything since then. But what we want to do is we're going to start off and talk about Kinston. So, Mr. BobLee, get into your column. Give us what feedback you had, and why don't you start off with why did you actually go ahead and write the column?
Well, it's about Kinston, but it's not. It's about my hometown, and that's a semantical difference. But I wrote about my hometown. The title is "My Hometown: From a Heaven to a Hell," and I just had a lengthy discussion, online discussion, with a gentleman in Kinston who did not agree with my column at all, to be kind. And so I explained to him why I wrote it. I wasn't trying to, I don't work for the Greenville Chamber of Commerce or the LaGrange Chamber of Commerce or anyone else. I had no other ulterior motive. I really wrote about my hometown and how, believe it or not, it's changed over 60 years since I left, about 55 years since I left. I grew up and I was born and raised in Kinston in the 50s and 60s, and it was an absolutely wonderful, happy days place to grow up for a middle-class white boy. And I was a middle-class white boy. Now I'm a white baby boomer. I didn't have any choice in that. That's what I was. And so when I say my memories of growing up in a small town like Kinston, which had about 20,000 people, which I guess would be big to someone in a small town like LaGrange or Grifton or some of the other really small towns in North Carolina, but it was a small town. And it was a wonderful, idyllic place to grow up in the 50s and 60s. Happy Days, Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, My Three Sons, all those shows. I lived those shows. And but that town of Kinston, even then, was maybe 40-60 or 60-40 white to black. It was very divided. Totally a segregated city, as most small towns in the South particularly were segregated in the 50s and 60s. And of course, the Civil Rights Act came in 1966, 67, somewhere around there. And Kinston schools were first integrated in 1965, my senior year in high school. There were two black children, boy and girl, who integrated our high school. And then it went real quickly after that over the next 2 or 3 years. And they did away with the black, or as they said back then, colored high school, which was called Adkin. And every town in North Carolina had a white and a black school system, white and black high school. They were to go by different names. There was Epps, I think, in one. I forgot what Goldsboro's was. Rocky Mounts was, I think, Washington, Booker Washington. Anyway, it was very common in all cities in the South, 50s and 60s, until the Civil Rights Act, had completely separate school systems, as did Kinston. But anyway, I wrote the column, one, because the News and Observer is in the midst of what I think is a 5-series series about Kinston, and the fact that it is the number one ranked in terms of poorest and crime-ridden towns, communities in North Carolina, and also appears on several national lists. I have nothing to do with those lists, as I have mentioned to several people who took issue with my column. I have nothing to do with that. I don't know how they're made up. I don't know whether someone buys their way in or off of such lists. I don't know what the agenda of the people who come up with the list are. I know my rule on polls, when you see a poll says Biden's popularity is such and such, or so many people are in favor of masks or vaccinating, the rule on polls is that you tend to believe the ones that reaffirm whatever your pre-existing opinion was of whatever the subject they're polling on. And you say, oh, the polls are great. They say this, and I agree with that. Oh, those polls are a bunch of crap, because they don't agree with the opinion I have about whatever the subject is. And that's simply the rule of polls. And so lists like top 10 list, or just like favorite Bond girls and favorite restaurant barbecue joints, it's all subjective. Now they base it on certain amount of crime per capita or average income or whatever I assume goes into that. But anyway, the News Observer, in their articles written by a reporter named Andrew Carter, who has been there for quite a while, really centered on the fact that Kinston, over the last 20 years, had produced an abnormal number of NBA basketball players. Going back long before 20 years, with Cedric Cornbread Maxwell, Jerry Stackhouse, Shaq, also known in this community around this part of the country as Mr. Amphibious, the late Charles Shackelford, who went to state, and more recently, Brandon Ingram, who's now a very good top NBA player, all-star, with the New Orleans team, and Reggie Bullock, who came from Kinston. So there are 5 or 6 or 7 Kinston black basketball players who come out of this little town that is now 66% black. And apparently the income and crime situation is significant. And despite all these hardships, and many of them grew up in the projects and certainly not in any kind of middle class or prosperous circumstance, but they've gone on to be millionaires in professional athletes. And how unusual that is that a little town like Kinston has more of these than Raleigh or than Charlotte or pretty much even larger cities. That why these kids coming out of Kinston that are so good? And it's been an article, and I think ESPN or one of the national sports people did a similar article a few years ago, noting the abnormal number that are being produced out of this little small town. What is it? They've won like 5 or 6 state championships in their classification over the last few years. But the other reason that article, those 2 articles that have come out, precipitated my saying, maybe I need to write this article from my point of view as someone who grew up in Kinston, went away, as a lot of people my age did. When you got 18, you went off to college, and from there, that was sort of your opening to the world, and you went out to seek your fortune in Atlanta or Charlotte or Washington or wherever you went. But you came out of Kinston, and not a lot of them went back even back then. You go back if you're going to take over your dad's business or family business, something like that. And I had, of my 200 people in my graduating class in 1965, I don't know how many, I want to say 30, 40, 50, maybe have stayed in Kinston and made decent, good lives for themselves in doing different things, providing goods and services that are needed in any community, dentists or insurance agents or real estate or whatever they might do. And people, when I say people who grew up in small towns in the 50s and 60s were very similar across the country, as I've learned in moving around the country, that people had similar memories if they were middle-class white people in the South, but even in pretty much anywhere we had similar memories that were based on what we saw on those TV shows. And Andy of Mayberry, of course, would be can't leave that out when you're talking about growing up in North Carolina, that Kinston had more than one barber. We had 7 or 8 Floyds or something. But it was very idyllic. I can't overuse the word idyllic for middle-class white folks. I don't know what it was like on the other side of the tracks, literally, because I never went over there. We didn't mix in recreation. They didn't come over and play basketball against us on our side of town or anything. It just simply wasn't. And there were separate and very unequal facilities back then. And I don't say that with any sense of pride or anything else. It's just the way it was. And if you didn't grow up back there at the end, I know you didn't. You had similar issues, not similar issues, but if you grew up where you grew up in New York. I don't know whether you were in a borough or you were upstate or out on Long Island or wherever. You can comment. But there was certain you grew up at the time that you grew up, and you're not quite as old as I am. So in the 50s and 60s, I won't ask where you were when Kennedy was shot. But anyway, we all know.
Well, I was gonna interrupt. I just remember as a little child seeing the funeral procession, and I think I remembered. I thought it was neat that horses were pulling a casket, but I didn't know anything of what was going on.
John saluting.
Yeah, and I don't know if I actually saw that or just got it in my memory because that.
Did you see Jack Ruby shoot Oswald in the basement of the Dallas Police headquarters?
No, I don't remember that. So I'm a little bit younger, but I kind of vaguely remember. I remember my parents taking me to the World Fair in Astoria, Queens. So yes, I'm one of those city kids, and I grew up in an ethnic neighborhood where I mean, it was, I could just go to a few blocks away and get any kind of food that I wanted from the folks that came from that country and settled in the US, and decide, hey, the way to start here in the US is to start my own restaurant. So that's my background. But I find this interesting because what you're talking about, I've seen in movies. I didn't move here to the South till '86, so a lot of stuff is not familiar to me, and I think a lot of folks appreciate you elaborating on that article.
So the truth hurts sometimes, and it's the way it was. And I go into it. Some of the things my mother thought, and my mother, she passed away about 20 years ago, but she was in her mid 90s when she passed away, with the exception of a couple of years when she followed my dad around as a colonel in World War II. She lived her entire life, born and raised literally, and died in Kinston. And she had some views that were very typical of her era. I never heard her use the N-word. Never heard her use the N-word. For no particular reason, she referred to them as colored people, not blacks or African Americans. It was colored people. And she had a certain socio-cultural hierarchy of her own, which was very similar to other white people in Kinston at that time and throughout the South, of where they ranked socially on the cultural hierarchy. And you look back now and you say, wow, that was kind of scary. Well, I guess it was. My dad was not in the Ku Klux Klan. I didn't know anyone in the Ku Klux Klan. But certainly the things that are used in some of these representations, there was one of John Grisham's first books. It had Kiefer Sutherland in it, and McConaughey, and Sandra Bullock, and it was about a black guy that his daughter gets raped, and then he kills the white kid that did it, and he goes on trial, and McConaughey is the lawyer and stuff. Anyway, kind of a stereotype circumstance. But I'm going to go back to what you were saying about growing up in New York. See, the people that come down to the South at that time couldn't understand the hierarchy, or the social cultural hierarchy between whites and blacks. We can't understand why you people up in New York had problems with the Irish or the Jews or whatnot. I mean, they were all white folks. Why would you look down on the Irish or the various other groups that came in through Ellis Island? Now, remember, I'm dating you a little bit. You weren't part of that group that came in the early 1900s. But you probably know what I'm talking about, that they were stereotyped certain ways. And they had the Irish and the Polacks and the different other nicknames they had that were very similar to the N-word, if you call them that. And you agree with me that you know enough about New York's growth and the Gangs of New York and some of those other movies that have been made about that, to comment that, yes, there was a social cultural hierarchy back then.
Yeah, I would agree with that. My parents, they didn't meet till they came to the U.S., but they came after World War II, and they both came from the communist Soviet Union. So and that's a whole nother discussion we can get into, socialism and communism. I think anybody who supports any of those beliefs here in the United States needs to spend a semester abroad in a communist country as a regular citizen, and they'll fully understand that they don't want it. But anyway, getting back to your topic, yeah, I grew up in an ethnic neighborhood. We had Poles, Slavic folks, Irish folks, Indian folks, Italians. And again, you're living in city blocks. There were certain areas you didn't go to if you weren't of that ethnicity, but also in your own neighborhood, if you had a mix, folks kind of defended each other regardless of your ethnicity or color. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think when you're talking about a big city, when I talk about a small town of 20,000, you could have had 20,000 within a 5-block area. So
yeah, very true.
Small town was your stomping grounds, where you went, your life bubble. I mean, I talk about in Raleigh now. We talk about certain things about Raleigh, the traffic and whatnot, and parking. I live within a mile. My world is within a mile of where I'm sitting right now. My barber, my accountant, my lawyer, various people, services things, where I go to get our groceries, my health club. My life is within a mile of where I am, and I'm very pleased. I mean, I do venture out of that on occasion to go to different restaurants and whatnot, but on a day-to-day basis, I live in a 1-mile bubble. and I'm really about half a mile from Crabtree Valley Mall, so pretty much everything is there. So is that any different than living in a small town? I don't know. I have my neighbors, and I will say my neighborhood where we've lived for 35 years is not like my neighborhood growing up in North Carolina, in Kinston in the 50s and 60s, where everybody just kind of, nobody locked their doors and all those different Mayberry type things that we get talked about all the time. But I want to go back to why I wrote the article. So the News and Observer did their two pieces that were all about the racial issues in Kinston, the drugs and the different things that the race and the crime, quite frankly, and I didn't mention this in the article, it's about 85% black on black crime. So the white part of town says, well, as long as they're not shooting and killing and raping us, we really don't care. And there is some of that. And they would deny it, but there is, and it would be if it in any of those towns where there's a racial part of town, and that has the drugs, and that has the shootings, and that has the crime, and that has the various things that just you don't want to go over there, daytime or nighttime, and people don't need to. But what was about 40% when I grew up in the 60s is now 65% and rising almost by the day in terms of the percentage of Kinston. So some of the people refer to it as a creep in Kinston, that the black influence, the neighborhoods is getting more and more across town. And again, I'm not passing value judgments. I'm simply telling people that that's what it is. I can take you back to Kinston and I could drive you around for about 30 minutes and show you some of the nicest, cleanest neighborhoods with middle-class houses that would sell probably for $400,000, $500,000 here in Raleigh. Another 50,000 add to it if you're in Cary, but or Chapel Hill. But after about 20 or 30 minutes, I've run out of places to take you. And then we've got to go by the mall that is a rotting corpse, a huge rotting corpse, empty, as are a lot of malls now. They've been what I call, people talk about being Walmarted. The walls have been Amazoned. They have been Jeff Bezos'd into oblivion because people don't shop at malls anymore. They just do it online and it comes to your front door. And that's another major seismic shift in how Americans do retail shopping and the effect that it has in malls. Kinston's downtown, which they touted in the 50s and 60s as the Magic Mile, that was their Chamber of Commerce Merchants Association. It was a 1 mile stretch along Queen Street, Main Street of Kinston. And at the far north end of Queen Street, there was a hill, and we had soapbox derby races there in the spring and summer. They close off the street, and you have the soapbox derbies going down the hill.
Can you tell people what soapbox derbies are? Because I'm I'm sure there are some people listening who do not know what that is.
You know what Girl Scout cookies are? Where have I lost track here? Soapbox, I don't know a whole lot about it. I think it started in Ohio. One of the tire companies probably had something to do with it, where kids, mainly boys back then, but I think they allowed girls to do it, but it was a boy kind of thing, would build little race cars that they would sit in, and not bigger than a big wheel, but it would be a 4-wheel wooden, originally made out of soap boxes, I guess, cardboard boxes or wooden boxes, and you would sit in them and get on a hill, and the gravity would take you down faster, hopefully, than your buddy in his soapbox derby beside you. And they would have these races where it was 1 against 1, and then they would drop a lot. I mean, you would be on a little ramp. The ramp would fall, and the thing would take off. You could steer them, but they had no power. There was no wind power. It was simply gravity moving it down, and there was no motor or anything to it. You couldn't pedal them. There was no pedals. It was simply gravity. So the steepness of the hill determined how fast, and you could tweak them and make them faster if you did grease the wheels, or I don't know. I never was into that myself, so I don't know how you gain an advantage over the other guy. They were very strict, much stricter than NASCAR. I mean, NASCAR has rules that you can and can't do with how you bore out your engine and stuff. So they had similar type of things in the soapbox derby. And they had a national one. So some kid would be the national soapbox derby winner. I don't know when that stopped, probably 40 years ago. And I don't know why it stopped. But they were a big deal in the 60s, all part of Mayberry and Happy Days. And it's interesting to me, kind of like what we talked about the other day, people not knowing who Lenny Rosenbluth is. that I would throw out the term soapbox derby, and you're attuned enough to know with your audience to say, you just lost X number of people who have no clue what you're talking about. And that takes us to the second reason that I wrote the column. My column has always targeted people like me, baby boomers, people who were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s. I don't know what the upper end of baby boomer world is, but it's somewhere in the early 60s, and considered baby boomers. And we were, of course, the largest retail demographic in American history. And for most of our lives, until like the last 10 years, we were what they call the pig being swallowed by the boa constrictor. You could always tell where we as a generation were as in American history, because Madison Avenue and everybody catered to us because we were the consumers, whether we were kids, whether we were in the 20s, whether we were in our adulthood, whatnot. Baby boomers have until recently been the largest demographic in America. So that's who everybody wanted to buy their cars, buy their soap, drink their beer, eat their hamburgers, everything else was based on us. Well, a lot of us have died, and we die every day now. And when we die now at our age, no one says, but he was so young, because we're not so young anymore. We're in our 70s, we're some in our 80s, some slightly above that. People my age, they deny it, but they check the obituaries. And when you see someone younger than you are, depending whatever the picture looks like, but they're younger than you are, and they died of natural causes, that causes you to get a big gulp. And if you're smart, you go hug your loved ones and make sure you got your will up to date, because you're kind of, I'm gonna say we're playing with house money, but it's similar. But baby boomers had such an idyllic life growing up, most of us. Certainly some had different, but for the most part, we had good lives. And they thought their hometown would be like a Walt Disney theme park of happy days, and it would never change. So they go off, they go to college, go off, and don't really come back, except maybe for a Christmas or Thanksgiving, or maybe a reunion, death of a friend, death of a parent. But they don't stay for any length of time, and they come back, let's say 20 years later, and that drive-in restaurant where they hung out and got the hamburger, and in Kinston it was called Pharaoh's. There were two. There was Pharaoh's on one side of town, Carlisle's on the other. And I don't mean black and white, but both was in the white part of town, Carlisle's and Pharaoh's. And that's where you hung out, just like in Happy Days. And that's gone. It's been gone for 25 years. There's something else there. It may be a Starbucks. I don't know. There's something else there. And the parks and everything that we grew up with and loved, most of it isn't there anymore, and we don't like that. It was supposed to stay dipping in lucite. Again, think of the concept of going to a theme park that's a Happy Days theme park, and you tell your grandchildren, well, I did that. I had one of those, and we did that. And, you know, we all got on our bicycles and chased the DDT mosquito truck down the street, which may explain for some of us are kind of weird now. We inhaled a lot of DDT from those fog trucks. But you mentioned chasing the fog truck. I have never brought that up to a baby boomer that didn't smile and say, oh, yeah, we did that. Now, did we lick the lead paint off the wall, and did we go down and, get the asbestos out of the ceiling? Well, I don't. Maybe some did. I think I know some people who probably did do that. But like chasing the fog truck, oh yeah, we all did that, and that was thanks to Rachel Carson, who does a whole opinion on Rachel Carson and what she did. The more people have died of malaria than the robin's eggs that broke because of whatever she was claiming that broke, and how many little kids in Africa have died of malaria as a result of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring book. Another subject for another day. Go ahead.
And I was going to say, do you want to briefly just, again, touch on what she did do? Because I know what it is, but there are, again, people out there that aren't aware of that.
Rachel Carson once won the Soapbox Derby, and getting everything. Rachel Carson, I don't know when the book came out, but it was called The Silent Spring, and it was about, it was kind of the beginning of ecology, that things that man is doing is hurting nature and will completely change the whole concept of man and nature getting along together. And something about DDT in the air and whatnot in the environment caused robins' eggs to the egg shells became thinner as a result, and therefore baby robins were dying. And so people immediately said, we've got to stop DDT. Well, that created a great deal of excitement within the world of the Anopheles mosquito and the Aedes mosquito, two different versions. I think both of them carry malaria, because the one thing that killed them was now being outlawed. Hooray! So the mosquitoes multiplied by the millions, and of course caused malaria, and people are still dying in Africa because of malaria. And Bill Gates and his fund will send thousands of malaria mosquito nets over there, but they won't send any DDT, and the DDT would kill the mosquitoes, and the little kids would live longer. But everything has an equal and opposite reaction in life. What you do has some kind of consequence. And so Kinston changed. The big thing in Kinston, the super change in Kinston was the tobacco industry. Kinston grew up calling itself the world's foremost tobacco center, and everybody knew somebody who worked in the tobacco business. The farmers all grew tobacco in the Kinston, Lenore County, and the environs. And the Kinston economy rose and fell throughout the year based on when they were selling tobacco and had money in their pockets to buy cars and to shop in the stores on the Magic Mile and whatnot. And all the talk about, look out, tobacco's in trouble, they're coming after big tobacco and whatnot. A lot of people in Kinston and throughout the tobacco areas thought that would never happen, that Kinston people would always smoke tobacco. Well, it happened. And so to the entire economy of Kinston, the straw that stirred the drink was tobacco industry. And it didn't dry up completely. I think they still export it to the Far East and whatnot, but nowhere like it was in the 50s and 60s, where they were, every other commercial, instead of being for mobile phones or insurance, was for cigarettes. And it was cool to smoke cigarettes. And we know now that wasn't particularly good for you at all.
I was going to interject. I remember as a kid, our family doctor would do our checkups, and I'm sitting there in front of the doc, and he's got a cigarette.
Sure.
And I didn't think anything of it. I was a little kid. I'm like, okay, that's normal. My dad smoked, the doc smoked, but now that I look back at it, it's like, holy cow. And I think what happens sometimes, and I appreciate you telling the story of Kinston, because I think people make judgments of the past based upon the present. And you know what? As a kid growing up, I didn't know anything better about the doc smoking cigarettes. He checked me out. I was okay. Sure. And I survived. So
one of the things about growing up in the tobacco country is cropping tobacco, harvesting it. And there's kind of a standing joke that the greatest incentive for a kid in Eastern North Carolina to go to college was so he wouldn't spend his life cropping tobacco. Because you would most of I never did it, but most of the people I know would in the summer help out their friends who were farmers by sending their kids out to do what was awful stoop labor work in the tobacco field. It's gummy and sticky and hot, and there's nothing good about it. There's no level of what you pick the suckers off. That's part of it, and then you pull the leaves off, and then you hang them in the barns, the tobacco barns, which are almost all gone now. They go up like a Roman candle when you light them, but they burn down or falling down, and if you find one, take a picture of it, because it's a classic Bob Timberlake type of picture. But the whole business is just dirty and hot and miserable. So you're out there thinking, if I don't get a college degree, this is what I'm going to have to do the rest of my life. Lord, let me get to college and do something to get out of the tobacco field. So
I'm going to interject again, because that brings a smile on my face, because that's my wife. She was a farm girl. She said that was the thing she hated the most. She went to UNC, got a degree in nursing, and has been helping in pediatric nursing, been helping little children's, come back to health. So yeah, that is a true incentive
for Eastern North Carolina. But if you were in Ohio or Pennsylvania, it was don't spend your life in the coal mines.
Right.
So it's amazing how different parts of the country, in California, that you don't want to be picking fruit and vegetables all your life. So get out of that. Education is the key to getting out of having to do that kind of lowest job on the occupational level, was education. And so in Eastern North Carolina, it was tobacco. Well, tobacco business kind of I don't know what the actual date was in the 70s and 80s when it happened, and big tobacco lost, and that forever changed Kinston. And about the same time, Kinston had one big manufacturing plant. It was a DuPont polyester plant that created polyester fibers that they would weave into whatever. And one of the lines that I really liked in my own stuff, I mean, if you don't like the own stuff you write, then why write it? Was if America had not kicked its 3 packs a day habit and leisure suits had stayed popular, Kinston's economy would never have gone in the tank. And I thought it was a great line. And 2 or 3 people actually noticed it and said, hey, that's a great line. But it's true. When they shut down DuPont, everybody knew people who worked at DuPont at various levels, from the entry level to the mid-management level to the chemists and the executives at the top. Everybody knew. And in fact, Kinston developed an entire large subdivision called Greenmead, the same way that Raleigh developed North Raleigh. The North Hills area of Raleigh was built for IBM. When IBM came here in the 60s and became the king of Research Triangle Park, and they brought all these people in here, all these damn Yankees and their pizza and their bagels and all this other crap, came in and moved into North Raleigh, the deal they made to entice RTP, to entice IBM, was we'll build you this entire section of town for your people to live in. And that's how North Raleigh, and you talk to people who were in Raleigh at that time, they never thought, why? Cameron Village was the center of town. And why are you building this thing halfway to Virginia, meaning North Hills, which, of course, now that's kind of midtown now, and there's 10, 20 miles beyond that is the outer belt line. But that shows how things evolve. But Kinston lost tobacco. It lost DuPont. At the same time, they had 3, I think there were 3, I may be wrong, there may be 4, 3 shirt factories that were the primary employers of the labor, the black community. And they all moved over offshore. They manufacturing. Of course, you have the hit from tobacco, the hit from DuPont, and shirt factories closing. There wasn't anything left to stir the economy. So there was no income going to people. So they couldn't buy cars and buy homes and do all the other things people do to consume if there's no ways to make money in the community. Now, I will tell a story that I left out. I think I put it in the comments, but I left it out of the original article. And it may be apocryphal, although I think it's probably true, that in the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, Kinston had an option by whoever, the city, the state, whatever. The state gave them an option. Did they want to be the location for a teachers college in Eastern North Carolina, ECTC, or did they want to have a mental retardation hospital and center, which became Caswell School? And the Wizards of Smarts in Kinston said, we'll take the mental retardation center. And Greenville got the little teachers college called ECTC, which you may know as East Carolina University with its huge medical center. And Greenville has now become obviously the heart of Eastern North Carolina economy. Rocky Mount, Wilson, to some degree, have had the same problems Kinston's had. Even though they have I-95 running right beside them, that has not been enough to keep them prosperous. And some of the reasons are a little bit different, but Greenville got East Carolina, and Kinston got Caswell Center. And Caswell Center is a nice place, and I'm sure it served its purpose for people being able to send their children there and get special needs care and whatnot. And I don't know a whole lot about what they've done there, but it's been a lot of good stuff, but it hasn't anywhere near the impact at all. If you drive into Kinston, you'll see it on the left-hand side of the road before you get to the dead mall, Caswell School. You had a choice between Caswell School and Kinston. And such decisions are the way life deals with cities. They make choices, they make decisions, and their decisions have consequences. So really, Kinston from the 60s to Kinston 2020 is a series of circumstances and consequences. And one of the lines I came up with is a city, a town, is like a living organism. It's never the same, like a moving river. It's never the same. And its future, its present, its future determined by how it deals with circumstances and consequences. And the loss of tobacco, okay, did we immediately help our farmers switch to soybeans or watermelons or something else that they can use as a cash crop? do we go out and get another DuPont to come in here and give them major tax breaks? And like what's happening in, I think Greensboro, Winston-Salem now just announced this big supersonic aircraft plant that's supposed to come in there in a few years. And then the other thing that Kinston had that hit it was the Global Transport, and that came out in the 90s. And I talk about how I was at a presentation. At that time, I was kind of a little tiny mover shaker in Raleigh in the early 90s, and was invited to a presentation by a professor over at UNC named John Casada, Kasada. And he's come up with this concept of locating manufacturing plants on an airport runway where the planes could come in with the parts and unload them and load up the goods and services to take out the finished product. And it was a fantastic idea. And it was based on a 500-mile concentric circle around that location of that transport to make it work. Well, I won't get into the particulars because I'll probably get my butt sued if I do, but it didn't happen quite that way. And so if you've got to make this idea work, you put it in a 500-mile concentric circle of enough places that it would work. Now, if you look at a map, you say, well, Tennessee and Kentucky, kind of ideal for that. Well, yeah, they were. But it got to Kinston because someone happened to own a lot of otherwise useless land around the airport there, the little regional airport, Stallings-Field, and he happened to know the governor at the time, and so Kinston got it. And there was a big feasibility study done of how to do it. And the people of Kinston were just overjoyed because they were saved now. And it was going to be the next Research Triangle Park. And everybody's going to make money and sell their houses and build better houses. And it's just going to be wonderful. And it never happened because somebody at some point finally looked at a map and said, well, 40% of this 500-mile concentric circle is in the Atlantic Ocean. Think about that. And there's not an interstate highway within 60 miles of Kinston. Think about that. Well, hell, this ain't going to work. And it hasn't. There've been a couple of things that have come in there and left and something, but not at all like what Casada envisioned. And I think it would have worked. And in fact, a friend of mine who's really into that stuff and knows a whole lot more about it than I've ever known, said Louisville, Kentucky would have been ideal for it, and it probably would have. But you, again, draw a 500-mile circle around Louisville, Kentucky, or probably Nashville would have worked. And it might have been smaller towns in those areas that might have had an airport would have worked. And so it's that all that combined on top of Kinston in the last 60 years, and Kinston 1965 to Kinston 2020. That's how it all happened. And again, and you throw in the civil rights thing, and Kinston didn't like most cities, it didn't handle the Civil Rights Act and integration very well. There was a lot of resistance to it for reasons that sometimes are hard to justify when we kind of step back now, but we weren't stepping back then. It was not the way it was ever been, and there was opposition to it. Maybe politically it was handled wrong by people, and you and I share a political ilk. But we won't get into blaming that. I mean, as I said, I knew more Mormons than I knew Republicans when I was growing up in Kinston. There weren't very many Mormons in Kinston, but there were more Mormons than there were Republicans in North Carolina in the 60s. So some of the mistakes that were made, can't blame it on Republicans, and certainly can't blame it on Donald Trump, because there weren't enough of them to have a 3-on-3 basketball tournament in the 60s in North Carolina. Now, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, those areas produced what is called a Jesse-crat. And those people who were registered Democrats voted for Jesse Helms for six times, ever how many times he ran, because he was their kind of guy and supported them and did a great job. But Jesse was always elected by Democrats more than Republicans. That's not I didn't come up with that idea. That can be verified. But again, they were more. We can use that line. They were more Mormons in Kinston than they were Republicans. But I don't know the contrast of religion to a politics, but that's the line anyway. I think like you're getting ready to say something, Gene.
No, I was going to say that's a good comparison. Religion and politics, because we see some folks that for them politics is a religion. So that's
I wasn't going to get into that, but yeah.
No. You mentioned in your column, and I just want to jog back this. You were talking about your mom and the fact that she pretty much stayed there, except for when your dad was in the military. I guess you moved around a little bit, but what you said her concept of getting out of town was what? Going over to the next town? I mean,
Goldsboro. Yeah, well, let's go to Goldsboro. Well, why?
okay.
Why do you want to go to Goldsboro? What's Goldsboro got that we don't have here? She didn't travel a lot. Now, my mother was, like most people, my mom was a wonderful person. She loved me. I was an only child. My parents were a little bit older than most parents when I was born. I was kind of gee, where did he come from? And my mom was 40, my dad was 50 when I was born. So I kind of skipped a generation in there. And growing up, it was always unusual to me that my friends' parents were the children of my parents' friends.
Right.
Kind of the 20-year difference there. Instead of my mom being 20, my dad being 30 when I was born, or mom being 25, like a lot of children were back then. It was different, but I didn't know it was the only way I grew up. So it's like growing up in a small town versus growing up in New York. We only know what we did, what our own experiences were, and we can try to study other people's or try to see the comparisons or the differences. But really, that was my life, and that was my growing up. But my mom and dad both were born in Kinston. They grew up literally across the street from each other, on Caswell Street in Kinston. Both houses are long since been destroyed or torn down, and anonymous little commercial office buildings put there and whatnot, which are pretty much vacant now. But and they loved being in Kinston. They were always proud to be from Kinston. My dad went off to Carolina for 2 years. This was in World War I. He left to go to the war. He was in the artillery in World War I, loved the Army, stayed in the Army, came out World War II. He was an engineer and went over and helped Chiang Kai-shek build the Burma Road, China and whatnot. If anyone's familiar with the book Never So Few with Frank Sinatra, that was kind of about that part of building the Burma Road and Chiang Kai-shek and whatnot. It went on during the war, but they were reassigned a lot during World War II. So my mom would travel with him when he was at Fort Sill or Fort Jackson or Fort Benning in different places. Fort Sill for the most part, but other than that, she lived in Kinston all her life. When the war was over, my father came back and started the National Guard unit in Kinston and began his surveying business. And we built our home, and that home I lived was my home for 40 years. I was 4 years old when I moved in there, lived there for the 18 years that I was in Kinston, going back to school to Chapel Hill. And I'm actually an hour and 55 minutes from my front door to Airing House Dorm in Chapel Hill, which was one of the new dorms back then, Airing House and Craig. And
what kind of car were you driving back then?
A Plymouth Valiant with an AM radio. I love that little car. And like everybody else who had cars back then, I wish I still had that car.
Yeah, slam 6 engine in it, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. And it was a standard transmission. And anyway, it was an hour and 55 minutes from my Airing House dorm to my front door in Kinston. And my mom stayed there. My dad died when I was a junior at Chapel Hill. I was at the second Super Bowl when he had a stroke earlier and caught pneumonia and passed away that weekend. So I always remember that by how many Super Bowls we're having. But my mom stayed there in the home, and then she stayed there till a couple of years before she passed away in the mid-'90s, and that was almost 20 years ago, not quite, maybe 17 years ago. And loved Kinston. Her mother had been there. Her sisters and brothers, for the most part, stayed there. So her life and the people who meant the most to her were in Kinston, and she was always very proud of it, but she couldn't relate it to anything else. Well, I like Kinston better than name a city. She didn't know anything about the other city. So she was somewhat limited that way. My father loved to travel, and he was, I would say, much more broad-minded in terms of finding new people and people who maybe been different and talking to them. And some of his travels during the service kind of gave him that appreciation for people in general. And my mother just never saw a reason to go anywhere. And, again, is that good or bad? Well, she was happy where she was. But the idea of, well, let's go to Goldsboro to go shopping or to have dinner at Goldsboro, and it was like, well, why? Well, Goldsboro was 20 miles away. Went to Goldsboro more than Greenville because my father had a sister over there. but didn't like the beach at all. My mother didn't like the beach. My grandmother used to have a home a summer home on Evans Street in Moorhead that she would go down every Memorial Day and stay through Labor Day and then come back. And my mother, we would go down on Sundays and have dinner at Tony's, the sanitary fish market. Tony's, you never called it sanitary fish market, you called it Tony's. Still there, still probably called Tony's. And we'd come back that afternoon because my mother didn't like the beach. And kind of unusual people in North Carolina for the beach is kind of die and go to heaven. But,
yeah, the beach is one of my wife's favorite places. I do appreciate you sharing this history. Can we touch on, and you and I briefly touched on this before, the comments you got? You said this was one of those columns that you had written that
oh yeah,
I think you had close to 100 different comments.
Yeah, it'll be 100.
I mean, people can go and read the comments, but can you talk about, the comments that kind of you reacted to and why you reacted to them? Were there, I mean, I'm sure you had some haters as well as folks that totally agree with you.
I won't call them haters, but yeah, they were haters. But that's okay. But it's funny, and I'm one of my side businesses now that I don't want to get into now because CIA will come down on me if I do, involves polling and national opinions and stuff and getting people's opinion. And it's part of human nature. If you get 100 attaboys and one you son of a bitch, it's the you son of a bitch comment that you concentrate on. It worries you. Oh my God, somebody doesn't like me out there. Well, yeah, but 100 other people do like you. Yeah, I know, but why doesn't this person like me? That's human nature. And it's certainly when you do what I do with the columns that I put them out there and they get passed around. Most of my normal subscribers, they have accepted who I am. They like it. They identify with me. They find that I have had similar experiences with them in their life. They can identify with the fact that I may remember them differently than they do, and we talk about it. And which is my column, as you know, that people, I can't do anything about the fact that I graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I went to college there. Did it change my life forever? Well, no more so than the fact that I had an F-150 pickup truck for 10 years and it was a Ford. If it had been a Chevrolet, would I have been different? So, am I ever indebted to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill? No, I made some good friends there. I still have them. But if I'd gone to William and Mary or Wake Forest, I figured I would have had good friends there and still have them. And would have gotten an education. But you change anything in your life, you change everything because it doesn't work that way. So every decision that you make or don't make affects every decision you make or don't make from that point on. Who you marry, whatever, all these decisions come in that, gee, if I just done that differently, would everything else have been better? Well, yeah, but a lot of the stuff that got better wouldn't happen anymore. If I'd married someone else, I wouldn't have the wonderful family and grandchildren that I have. And not that I've ever considered that, but every decision you make. So, born in Kinston, I had nothing to do with that. Being a middle-class white boy, I had nothing to do with that. What people were saying now that maybe I could have identified in the girl and been a middle-class white girl back then. We weren't into that back in Kinston in the early 60s.
Let's not get into that.
I got you there, didn't I, Caitlin? I snuck that in on you. But anyway, the comments that I've gotten over 90, and it'll be well over 100 before it stops circulating around because now it's getting to have you seen this crap that this idiot up in Raleigh wrote? But most of them have been positive because my people like me and I like my people. And so they kind of expected, and I knew a lot of them came from similar backgrounds. So one of the first ones I got was a good friend of mine in Lexington. He described Lexington then and Lexington now. And some others were from Monroe and different places, a small town around North Carolina. Had a guy from Rocky Mount talk about it. He's claiming Rocky Mount's worse than Kinston now. People take pride in being the worst. I understand people in Lumberton and Laurinburg are very upset that Kinston was number one on the list for most crime-ridden small town in America, and they thought they ought to be. I don't know, but why people take pride in being on the top of any list, regardless of what the list is. We ought to be there. We're worse than they are, by God. But most of the comments have been very positive. I've gotten, I'll say 4 that were not so much. And I responded to them because I respond to every comment that I get. Vice versa, law, they don't really get into talking about my mama in a nasty way, and nobody does that. I mean, when I talk about Carolina and state and how when I went back when everybody was talking about the Carolinas' greatest athletic eligibility fraud in the history of the NCAA, which I think it was. I didn't make a lot of friends over Chapel Hill. I kid that there's still a bounty on my head on Franklin Street that only Coach K comes close to matching because of some of the things I've said about some of the things that have gone over there, and my classifying former Chancellor Folk as Chancellor Chihuahua, that went over real big. Back when Chansky and I were doing our radio show, every once in a while I'd put in something like that and the phone would ring. And that's what they had me. I said, Jake, why do you want me on this show? You know how I feel about something. Oh, people will like that. No, they didn't. Well, some did, but the ones that didn't, very vocal. And
is that why you stopped doing the show at Art? Because
no, they couldn't. The station was being sold, and Jim Hefner was selling it, and somebody was buying it, and they just, I don't know. No, people liked it really, and. The time that I forgot, we were doing a Thursday night game. And so we did a special show for Thursday night. It was pregame football. It had nothing to do with Kinston, but it's a great little story. So we were doing the article, we were doing the show from a sports bar out at Eastgate Shopping Center, I think. I may be wrong, but we were doing it on location there. And we had a roving reporter downtown. The big deal, I think, it may have been Florida State. I forgot who we were playing. It was a Thursday night game in Kinston Stadium, which we haven't had that many of them. So we had a roving reporter downtown, and Chancellor Folk from Dartmouth, by the way, if you don't remember, she was from Dartmouth. Dartmouth. Don't know what I think of her. But anyway, so she was walking around and meeting people, and hi, how are you? And I don't know what color cause ribbon she was wearing that day. She always had a cause ribbon pinned to her jacket. And so our reporter was interviewing her. Chancellor Folk, what do you think about this and ACC football? And do you hate the people at State as bad as everybody else does? And do you hate the people at State more than you hate the people at Duke? And usual questions that you ask on Franklin Street. And so to finish and went back to us, and so Art and I were talking about the interview, and I said, he didn't ask the key question everybody really wants to know about Chancellor Folk. And Art, without thinking, said, and what would that be, BobLee? And I said, is she a dwarf or a midget? Ooh, the phone lit up on that one. And it was something else. And I think, the phrase, once you go black, you never go back. You probably never heard that. You have no idea what it's about. Well, neither did Art. And we had our engineer was a black guy, I forgot his name, nice guy. And somehow it came out the phrase, I think we were wearing black jerseys, is what it was. Carolina, Butch Davis or Fedora, one of them, wearing black jerseys that day. And that always upset the Carolina people. Oh, it ought to be blue and white. What the hell doing black? The guy said, once you go black, and I'm not going to explain that one, Galen. So if your listeners in Chatham County don't know what I'm talking about, they're not going to know what I'm talking about. They can go to a Soapbox Derby and ask somebody there. But go black, and Chansky had no idea what that meant. And I've forgotten what his comment was, but it was like, whoa, Art, I don't think you really mean that. Yeah, better back off there, Art. And little Jewish boy from Boston, what the hell did he know? But anyway, those were the good times with the sports, the good sports, AC and BobLee. Anyway, what was I? I was in deep in some discussion about what?
We were finishing up on the comments about the haters out there.
Anyway,
again, not having grown up north in a big city, a lot of this I've kind of heard. I love you sharing your experience, and I know there's going to be people who are going to listen to this and they're going to pick it apart, but that's part of history. And I think I'm a firm believer that by preserving history, you learn from history and really do not repeat some of the mistakes that we've made.
And it's so ridiculous when you look back on it. And some of the things that were going on in Kinston in the 60s, you look back and go, whoa, I was a kid. What the hell am I going to know? I'm not going to lead a protest march. I wasn't that smart. But I go back later and you say, whoa, that was really, yeah, that was awful. What the circumstances and whatnot. But I want to go back to the comments. This is a 3-hour discussion if we wanted to have it. Mind talking about it again if you want to. But the comments were mostly almost all positive. People said, yes, you remember that. Boy, that's something I didn't know that. The only thing I know about Kinston is I stopped to pee there at the new sports shop on the way to the beach, which is all most people in Raleigh, Greensboro area know about Kinston. It's a bypass, has King's Barbecue and new sports shop. And that's basically because it's an hour and a half away where people would stop to go to the bathroom and maybe get a candy bar or maybe some plate of barbecue at King's or pick up something at New Sports Shop, and it's on the bypass, so you never see Kinston. It's not even you got to cross the Neuse River to get to downtown Kinston, and they never saw reason to do that. So that's their view of Kinston is a shopping center on I-70 bypass, Highway 70 bypass. But anyway, so for the first 2 or 3 days, I think the column came out. I want to say last Friday, I believe.
Out there for a week.
Yeah, but it germinated, and people started passing it around. And before I know it, I'm starting to get, I think now I've gotten 3. Highly indignant, how dare you, from people in Kinston. I won't mention their names because I think it's 2 of them I've kind of made peace. And I said, I appreciate your views. You're entitled to your views, and you may be right. And maybe I was too cynical, and maybe you're too sensitive, and whatever. But I was, I replied to them. And made sure they understood I had nothing to do with that poll that had Kinston #1 as the most crime-ridden, poverty-stricken town in North Carolina. I didn't get a vote in that. And don't blame me for that. I didn't write those Houston Observer articles. Don't blame me for that. Blame me for what I said there, and you don't like that. That's fine. And the fact that I write provocative stuff, it's what I've been doing for 20 years. I've written 2,500-plus columns, and most of them are provocative. The one I wrote about when they hired Butch Davis, did Carolina marry a stripper? That's a famous one. Talked about what Carolina got by saying Butch come and waking the sleeping giant and how that all turned out. And one of my favorite was 2 cheerleaders in a toilet stall. And I'm sure you've memorized that one. The 2 Carolina Panther cheerleaders that went down to a game in Tampa Bay, a place called Banana Joe's. And first thing you know, there's strange noises coming out of one of the toilet stalls in the women's bathroom. And they went in and found 2 Carolina cheerleaders doing whatever 2 women do in a toilet stall in a Banana Joe's restroom. But the headline was the key. I mean, it wasn't what they were doing. None of my business. But 2 cheerleaders in a toilet stall, you spend your whole life never see a headline that good, particularly if you're in the ain't people crazy business. And that's what I'm in. And I saw that other day. I was going to put it, I'm just started a Substack account. You familiar with Substack, Gene?
Yes, I am familiar with Substack. Why don't you tell folks a little bit about that? Look, BobLee, we got like about 2 minutes. I really don't want this to go past an hour.
Okay. All right.
We can always talk again next week. So
yes, it ain't going to change, and I ain't going to change. Go ahead.
But no, go ahead. 2 minutes about Substack. Let folks know what you're doing with that.
Substack is a place where writers who have been fired for their political views or wokeness views or whatever can go to Substack and write their columns and send it out to anybody who wants to hear it. They can pay. So some of these people that have lost their livelihoods because of their political opinions, and one of them was with the New York Times, and she got fired for telling the world how awful the New York Times is, and she's got a very successful column on Substack. So people pay like $5 a month to get all her columns, and she writes about 2 a day. Very prolific. Her name is Barry Weiss, and her views. She's an avowed liberal, but her views really aren't, and kind of like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan is, nobody's ever called him a conservative or a crazy right-winger. He's a hippie liberal. And look at the mess he's in. That's a subject for another day. We probably can't squeeze that one in 30 seconds.
No, but we can definitely talk about that. I actually listened to part of his talk with Jordan Peterson. That was interesting. And I also listened to some of the controversial ones that he had out there that, you know what, there are different views from different people. And that's why I enjoy talking to you. Folks, I've got to shut this down because we're getting to an hour, and usually an hour is kind of like the max that folks would go. And this will leave more material for Bob to inform us later on down the road. Folks, let me do a quick pop-up here on Mr. BobLee. You need to go and check out his site. You may not agree with him, but you know what? You won't get bored reading his stuff. So he is on Facebook, and I'm going to pop that up below, facebook.com/BobLeeNC, and he is also has his own webpage, and you've had that for what, almost 20 years, BobLee says that. So, folks, thank you for watching. Hey, you know what? We may be back again next Thursday if Mr. BobLee's up for that. He looks good because he now has his own new light.
Always good to talk to you, my friend.
We're going to say bye, and Mr. Bob, just hold on.